second lecture in the church lecture series this spring. I think, before we go any further, I would just like to say thanks to Mark Stanley and the lecture series committee, which I think is made up of Rana, Diane, and Jennifer helped last fall. But I think the series has been really good so far this year. The attendance has been great, and we've had a lot of diversity as far as the speakers go. So it's a really exciting series, and I think it just keeps getting better every year. And I guess another quick note along those lines, next week, you want to go ahead and put on your calendar, it's Nicholas de Mansha. That's February 27th at 5:30 p.m. I believe he's at UC Berkeley. Okay, so that should be another interesting lecture in the series. But getting on to the business at hand, so it's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to say a few words about Brad. He's been an integral part of the School of Landscape Architecture for quite some time. And I'm sure he's going to talk quite a bit tonight about the work that he's done since he's been here. And I thought that what I would do is just try to tell you a little bit more about what happened, what kind of led to Brad's getting to UT. So Brad is in some ways kind of typical for a lot of practicing landscape architects in the state of Tennessee, in that he came here to do his undergrad. So Brad's undergrad degree is from the from the Ornamental Horticulture and Landscape Design degree in the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources. And during that time, he really became increasingly interested and aware of the potentials of landscape architecture, and started to think about pursuing that career. At the time, there was no accredited degree. There was no landscape architecture degree in 2008 because this program didn't there was no accredited landscape architecture degree in the state because this program didn't actually start till 2008. So what we see is, as you start to meet practitioners in the state, a lot of them went through that actual undergrad degree program and then moved on to other master's degree programs in the region, like Georgia, Clemson, and Brad landed at OSU. So he pursued a Master of Landscape Architecture and finished that degree in 2004. I should probably say that it's a testament to his character that he still is a Vol football fan. So in the time I've known him, given OSU's kind of ascendancy and Tennessee's doing what it's doing, he's sticking with Tennessee. So after he got done at Ohio State, he went to EDSA in Orlando. EDSA is a very well-known international firm in landscape architecture, been around since probably Brad, the 50s or 60s. And so he was there for 7 years, from 2004 to 2011. During that time, he worked up to the senior associate level and worked on projects ranging widely in scale, as landscape architecture offices often do, from the kind of detailed site projects to large-scale master planning work. And I think, from my perspective, and Brad and I have talked a little bit about this, I think this is a common ground that Brad and I share. We both went into professional practice after our graduate degrees, and I think really looked at that practice very critically, and so it still informs the way we teach today. Okay, so I talk about it in terms of what I call projective pragmatics, which is that we are aware of and focused on giving students the skills they need to operate in the professional world, the real world skills that so many people are looking for. But we're also doing it from this kind of critical perspective, which aims to push the practice forward. And whether that's through technical means or conceptual, there's always a kind of pushing out and trying to think about where else the profession of landscape architecture can go. So Brad then came back in 2011 as an assistant professor and has been instrumental, as I said, in the advancement of the School of Architecture, or School of Landscape Architecture, since his arrival. Interestingly enough, for landscape architecture, we are a two-college program. So we're supported by the College of Architecture and Design and the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources. So Brad's kind of formal home on campus is actually in Kasner on the West Campus in the Plant Sciences Department. But the majority of his teaching is for core classes in the landscape architecture curriculum. But he still teaches undergraduate classes quite frequently in plant sci, and he also does service on both sides, which I'm sure is a joy. And so, lastly, I would just like to say, kind of thinking about the trajectory that I've seen, we talk a lot in landscape architecture these days about what I refer to maybe as the performative turn. And so since, say, mid-90s, I would argue, with the rise of landscape urbanism, as well as architecture's kind of interest in the how over the why, we've increasingly in landscape architecture been talking about performance and how landscape architecture can do more than just look good, but it can actually work. And so I think that this is a really exciting notion, this idea of performance in landscape architecture, but I also think it's one of those ones that it's something that we have to think very critically about. There's a lot of kind of mediocre work done in the name of performance that maybe is too heavily engineering and not thinking maybe enough about the more traditional values of landscape architecture, which are the aesthetic and the experiential. But from what I've seen in Brad's work, I feel like that he's really trying to engage that full range of landscape architecture, and I'm excited to see the trajectory for where his work goes next. So welcome, Brad.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Gail, for that introduction. I guess with the things that you said, I can actually skip through the first 30 slides on my PowerPoint. That's right. But no, it's truly an honor to be here in front of everybody here today to participate in the church lecture series and to stand at the same podium as the esteemed designers of our time, the esteemed faculty members who I have the privilege of working alongside. Though I note that I'm not quite the draw that Peter Walker is. It's still a really robust crowd full of great familiar faces and friends that have been on this journey with me. I thought that what I would do with our time here this evening is to share a retrospective on my time as an assistant professor here at the University of Tennessee, and to set a trajectory for what I see my future efforts being, at least as best as I can tell, at this particular moment. As many well know, this presentation is actually connected to my application for tenure and promotion. That application was submitted this fall. Many of you have gone through this process as well, Abigail most recently. There are many words that we can use to describe that process. Not all of them can we say here in front of such crowds, but one word that stuck out in my mind, and one thing that I've come to appreciate about the process of preparing these materials, is the opportunity to reflect. And the opportunity to reflect on one's career and to think about the things that have influenced why I think the way that I think, why I conceptualize landscape in the way that I do, things that from in hindsight at 30,000 feet seem remarkably clear, at least at this point, but at the moment were a little more kind of hidden in their meanings. So my purpose here tonight is to talk through from this kind of position of prospect over my career, why it is that I am who I am as a professor and as a professional as well. So this process is indeed a process. It's a journey, and the journey that we all encounter in our lives is full of different types of pathways where there may be moments when the way forward, though is not incredibly easy, seems relatively evident in what it is that we're expected to do or what it is that we want to do. There are also moments on that pathway, though it may carry markings, the language in the direction that one may take is not as clear, and what may lay ahead is a little less evident. There are other moments on that pathway where you seem to be faced with infinite options and opportunities to take a trajectory and make a choice, head in a particular direction, and not looked back. And other points on that trail where the path ahead is perhaps mysterious, but still you push forward because you know of the promises of the rewards and also the promises of the risks that lie ahead. So it is through these frames that I will kind of look at my activity as an assistant professor here at the University of Tennessee School of Landscape Architecture. However, to understand what it is that brought me to that point, we have to go a little deeper into my own story, into points of my history where photography was not pixels, but rather something that needed to be developed and scanned. So if I think about my earliest exploits in landscape, those exploits transcended scales, visiting national parks, state parks, logging hundreds of miles, hiking and backpacking across the backcountry, building forts in the backyard, hunting for geodes and for crawdads in the creek. However, it was my earliest understanding of what the individual's ability to influence the landscape or to act upon the landscape as a designer were actually realized, as Gail mentioned, here at the University of Tennessee. It was here as an undergraduate in the OHLD program. I trip over that every time I try to say it out in full, so we'll just go with that. So I began my investigation in landscape here, learning from some of the same faculty who are in this room and who I have the privilege of now working alongside. Some who are not here, Sam Rogers, Sue Hamilton, Gary Menendez was on the faculty at that time. Curtis, I know you're here, but you actually hadn't quite arrived yet, so we didn't have that opportunity to overlap. So it was through the undergraduate coursework with these individuals that I came to understand the fundamental science of horticulture. As Gail mentioned, this was a program in the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources, and developing skills in designing and constructing landscapes at the residential scale. It was actually as an undergraduate that for the first time I ever heard the words landscape and architecture said in the same sentence, and actually it was Gary Menendez who said that. A funny kind of side note is he presented to an introduction to horticulture class and was talking about the work that he was doing as a landscape architect, and I came up to him afterwards and I said, Gary, I want to be a landscape architect. And he said, Brad, what are you doing here? It was not a landscape architecture program, but I persisted nonetheless because I saw the potential and the value in the type of program that I was embarking under. And at the time, given my understanding and where I was in kind of my maturation of what landscape is, it was a perfect place for me to be. So it was through this undergraduate coursework in horticulture and landscape design, but also through a minor in urban studies, that I came to appreciate the influence of the greater built environment on the human experience and the influence that one may have in shaping that experience as a landscape architect. As Gail mentioned, I decided that I would pursue my graduate studies in landscape architecture immediately following my undergraduate studies at the Ohio State University. Right? The is in all caps. Though as Gail mentioned, my allegiances are still here at the University of Tennessee. The great football coach at Ohio State said that anything easy isn't worth a damn, so I'm sticking with being a Vol fan. At the time of enrollment at Ohio State, the faculty was comprised of what I would consider to be regional legends in landscape architecture education. The likes of Larry Walquist, Norman Booth, Jim Hiss, Brooks Breeden, and Doug Way, some of whom had written the textbooks that I used as an undergraduate, and all of whom had more than 20 years teaching experience at the university, were those from whom I would be learning. The curriculum at Ohio State closely reflected the life work of these great friends of mine. And it was under their mentorship that I was trained in the traditions of landscape architectural hand graphics, site engineering, the planning process, and real estate development. Looking back at that time, it was clear that there was a deliberate choice made by that program that they were going to prepare their graduates to enter the practice of landscape architecture to provide professional services for real estate development and planning. Producing job-ready and productive graduates in this sector was their brand, and they were very, very good at it. The formula for success in the pursuit of this was well known and had been fine-tuned over time. My classmates and I became adept at sizing pipes, calculating super elevations and vertical curves for roads, grading and designing parking lots. We utilized hand graphic techniques and CAD as a means to design and construct and to document construction. Site planning was a linear and prescriptive process. Reading the landscape using a McCargian approach, respecting the site limitations, understanding and leveraging the opportunities, and essentially getting the program to fit on the site, and form most definitely followed function. Both form and function were employed to protect the health, safety, and welfare, and to essentially create a sense of place. It was also during my time at Ohio State that I first began to explore in digital tools for design representation. Form-Z was actually a proprietary software developed at Ohio State by an architecture student there. And Doug Way, who had also taught at GSD, was a curator of national surveillance technology and global information systems and secrets that we all would always pry him about, but that he would never tell us what was actually happening. So understanding and thinking about these landscapes as larger systems and as larger infrastructures was something that I began to catch a glimpse of at Ohio State. And it was also at Ohio State that I had my first experience in traveling internationally, visiting Slovenia for the first time, a place that would become very important to me, as we'll see later on, and also discovering a passion for seeing and experiencing the environment through drawing. Now, 2004 was a good year to be a graduate in landscape architecture. The real estate speculation bubble was humming right along at breakneck speed, and it seemed that one only needed a pulse to get multiple offers in landscape architecture at the time. I'd like to think that I was bringing much more to the table than that pulse. As is Gail mentioned, I began working with EDSA in Orlando, Florida, a very large and prestigious landscape architecture firm that had been doing work since the mid-'60s. One of the largest corporate landscape architecture practices in the world, and that they're sought after for their unrivaled portfolio in hospitality design and community planning. My training at Ohio State and my then comprehension of landscape as an instrument of economic transaction, aesthetic experience in retreat, and my skills for documentation of design and project management were immediately put to work through the types of projects that I would undergo there. I spent 7 incredibly happy and productive years with the firm. Projects that I worked on took me around the southeastern United States and the Caribbean to places like Dallas, Texas, Springfield, Missouri, Orlando, Florida, and Owensboro, Kentucky, and also the Cayman Islands. The projects that I consulted on around the world included places like New Songdo, South Korea, Al Ain, United Arab Emirates, and many projects in China as well. The firm, it was in the firm that I was working alongside a remarkable group of peers and mentors that I began to hit my stride in the profession. But it was actually through a rather serendipitous, voluntary professional development activity that I began to really find my voice and my calling as a designer, as a critical voice within the discipline. Though the firm's planning process and environmental ethic were true, my personal sensibilities as an environmental advocate, shaped by my earliest encounters with the landscape, did not always square with my clients' mandates, and as a project designer and as a project manager. In fact, it rarely ever did. So my interest in finding the better way was nourished through my engagement with the U.S. Green Building Council and my opportunity to study and become a LEED accredited professional, learning about the inspirational high-performance green building projects that were happening at the time. Now, there are many, perhaps many in this room, who are quick to criticize LEED and the U.S. Green Building Council for its shortcomings. I'd be happy to offer some of my own, but I would also like to attest through my own personal experience at its wide-reaching impact and influence as a continuing education initiative across the allied professions, and also its effect on mainstream architecture towards a paradigm of higher performance, which also happened to open my own eyes to the performative potential of the landscape. It was after this point that I quickly became frustrated by the relentless questions that I was asking and the limited opportunities that I would have to explore them through the types of projects that I was working on. Though functionally solid, the firm seemed very content with the legacy it had already forged. Exceptional customer service, solid environmentally sensitive planning, the work kept coming in, so the motivation to change the model was not necessarily there. Though an extraordinary experience in terms of interpersonal relationships and professional development, I found the work to become suddenly very professionally unfulfilling. Having survived the Great Recession and positioned myself for a career with the firm at the time, my decision to change career paths from professional services to academics was not one of necessity, but rather one of choice and one of curiosity. I'm grateful to those who gave me that opportunity, an individual who had no prior formal experience in teaching in landscape architecture or teaching at all, to join the faculty here at the school. The school was obviously something that was very important to me given my personal connection to the university. So being part of something very new and being part of building something very new was very appealing to me, as well as some of the other nuances of the program that I'll get into here in a bit. So it was through these life experiences in the phases of my career that I had come to realize that my earliest understandings and appreciations for landscape as a place of beauty and an understanding of landscape as something of horticultural proficiency and the social qualities of a place, that I began to really form and shape what it is that I wanted to share through my teaching here at the university. Finding that mutually beneficial relationship between nature and technology is something that I've deeply invested in my teaching, and also something that I aggressively have pursued through my other creative means and service here as part of the school. Fundamentally, understanding the conceptualizations of how one looks at nature over time is fundamental to my teaching. The tensions between the built landscape, technology, and the preserved landscape or nature, and the exploitations that it validated to the middle landscape in between, are the concerns that I look at in my, in my understanding of landscape. Thinking about and understanding and studying the iconic landscapes of our past, and also the canonical works of landscape architecture in the mid and late 20th century. Though it's difficult to compare these works up here on the wall to the work that I was doing at EDSA, I would suggest that perhaps some of our primary motivations for design were in fact shared. This idea of art, experience, beauty, representation, and ultimately maintaining a landscape in a state of kind of perpetuity, a static object. Worthy motivations and profound cultural impacts and social implications of these projects, but perhaps reductive to their conception of landscape as static sculptures, aesthetic surfaces and representations of nature, foregrounds of buildings, infrastructural screens, all operating at the scale of a site. What I've come to appreciate about landscape architecture, and what I expect actually attracts many of the graduate or many of the students that we have in our program, is the relevance of the profession in addressing some of the prevailing grand challenges of our time. Things like population change, environmental degradation, infrastructural degradation, food deserts, public health, and dealing with the abandoned and detritus and dross within our urban landscapes as that landscape changes and the economy changes over time. So it is through the lens of landscape performance and in the earlier writings of landscape urbanism that we begin to understand the practice of landscape architecture as a way of not respecting or seeing nature and technology as something that are separate and perhaps contradictory to one another, but rather thinking about landscape and technology as one and the same. Thinking about landscapes as infrastructures, thinking about landscapes as productive parts of cities, thinking about, as Jane Amadon projects here in her essay, Big Nature, landscapes that are preemptive and productive, generating landscapes such as carbon dioxide eating, biofuel producing algae farms, or public water gardens that are parts of civil infrastructures, parts of civic parks, and established novel priorities for our profession. So thinking about this idea of landscape not as something that is remote, something that is preserved, or something that is opposite from the city, but rather something that is a synthetic part of the city, how can we be designing and thinking about this in the way that we approach our practice? So thinking about what are the performances of a landscape, what are the potentials beyond the experiential, beyond the social, beyond the aesthetic, has become core to my teaching. Thinking about things like economic stimulation and social catalyzation, thinking about how landscape can affect public health and steward water resources, cleanse stormwater, prevent and manage contemporary challenges of flooding through climate change, and also be used and leveraged in a way that we can build cities or rebuild them as it may be. This approach to landscape, or this conceptualization of landscape architecture, has profound implications for the practice of landscape architecture. And as a result, I would suggest profound implications for the education of landscape architecture as well. Performance is changing the territories of practice from green fields to the underutilized fragments left over in our cities by the metabolism of real estate development. We're thinking about landscape as science, not necessarily as a biological science exclusively, but rather landscape as an experiment, an opportunity to test ideas and to think about the future in different ways. It's changing the way that we think about and select plant material for our projects or living materials in our work. Previous paradigms may suggest form, color, and texture would be on our list of criteria. However, in this performative paradigm, we need to be thinking about other performances and tolerances and dimensions of plants that we had previously not thought of. It changes the way that we think about maintenance. It changes the value of appearance and thinking about the performance of appearance as well. It changes the way that we visualize landscapes and the way that we think about the role of data and the way that we think about metrics as a tool to advocate for our projects. So with landscape performance as one of the fundamental tenets of my teaching, the other fundamental tenet I would suggest has been community engagement. In thinking about the way that the studio or the classroom can be extended through our engagement with community partners as a way of enhancing the student experience and providing for unique opportunities to provide value to the communities in which we operate. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the courses that I've taught and how this approach, these values, have manifest. Of course, I have predominant teaching responsibilities to the graduate landscape architecture program. However, I've also spent significant time teaching in the undergraduate landscape design program, including the fundamentals of landscape design, which when I encountered the course in 2011 as I joined the faculty, it had remarkably not changed much since I had taken the course myself more than 15 years prior. So I spent a lot of time and energy thinking about what are the fundamentals of landscape design, what are the ways in the context of this performative turn of the potential of landscape, how can we be thinking about that in an undergraduate program that is not leading towards a professionally accredited degree. And I found that opportunity in thinking about this idea of the performance of landscape as the fundamental itself. And through the projects that I've designed as a part of this course, exercising those opportunities, not necessarily limiting a student to thinking about the scope of their career in a residential practice, but also thinking about the potential for them to be operating as consultants to some of the largest landscape architectural design projects that are out there. So we used Stas's Detroit Future City framework to design a final project that some of you, I think Will is around here somewhere, right? So Will actually went through this exercise in thinking about this vacancy of the city of Detroit and what the potential futures of this site might be. And so thinking about those operative potential futures and challenging the students who 15 weeks or 10 weeks prior had not picked up a pen or a pencil or thought about design to begin to exercise this was a giant leap on my part. But I think that the results of the student work that came through as a result are actually quite remarkable in their ability to embrace and understand this as a fundamental part of their project. There's Will's project. So taking that idea of performative potentials and applying it to different project types, or as for those who remained interested in kind of that residential typology, to also apply that into that particular scale. I've also had the privilege of doing quite a bit of traveling with my colleague Gary Menendez, seeing the gardens and landscapes of the world, attending 4 different tours, attending those landscapes that we study, and that, if we were to visit this landscape in 5 years, would probably look very similar to the way that it is now. There certainly will still be selfie sticks at Versailles the next time I go, but also thinking about the landscapes of change, thinking about the landscapes that will be quite different the next time that we go, because of the way that they embrace the temporal qualities and the potentials of landscape as a catalyst for something different, as a catalyst for something new. So touring Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park while we were in London, visiting the water glades, which is part of the hydrologic metabolism of this site, but also an integral part of the public space and the public experience of this landscape, was something that was quite inspirational. Seeing similar landscapes in Amsterdam, I dare not try to pronounce the name of this park, there's far too many consonants, but thinking about how the ideas of habitat can be integrated into an urban landscape in a way that is still very quite formally compelling and interesting, and as Jane Amanan would suggest, socially seductive. I also got the opportunity through these trips to share my interest in seeing sites through drawing, thinking about ways and hopefully inspiring students to slow their trips down, to take the opportunity to see a space, not just to photograph a space, and do that through hand sketching and thinking about literal types of drawing, thinking about abstractions of the space that you see, thinking about putting yourselves above the space, a type of a drawing that you could only do if you truly had experienced it and understood what the space was about, and also beginning to maybe diagram and think about how it is that the landscape was coming together, how it is that it's performing in the way that it actually is. Most of my lifting has been done in the graduate program in landscape architecture. I'll talk briefly about professional practices in the sense that, again, thinking about this paradigm of performance may come through less literally, but the element of engagement comes through in very explicit ways. Thinking about expanding the classroom again by engaging a professional around the country or around our region every week. Thinking not only about the firm as a potential career path for landscape architects, but also thinking about education, thinking about public practice, thinking about nonprofit practice. Those who have been in the course and the feedback that I've gotten as a result suggests that this is an incredibly valuable use of our time and understanding what the potentials of their future careers might actually be, while also touring and visiting offices in regional destinations as an opportunity to understand the working environment of the landscape architect and to begin to build the language of professional practice regardless of what side you're participating on from, whether it's from the client side or from the private consultant side. Julie Beckman was so kind as to join us on our trip to Washington, D.C. a few years ago and getting that kind of firsthand insight into the design of the Pentagon Memorial that we visited on a very cold March day. A fundamental element of my teaching in studio has been this element of engagement as well. Over the course of my 6 studios, I've engaged over 7 partners and taken many students along for the ride, thinking about these questions of landscape performance and expanding the potential of the profession in the eyes of these communities that we engage through Plan East Tennessee, through the Smart Communities Initiative, and also through the River Studio and the River Project. It's through this broadening of the classroom that the students have attested to the value of understanding their study area and understanding the expertise that only the individuals who are experiencing them can provide. So seeing the different contexts and seeing the different conditions, interacting with the professionals who, in this particular case, we're working on a studio that was looking at water quality improvement in Southeast Tennessee. Working with the Chattanooga Department of Water Quality was an informative experience and an informative day. Seeing those infrastructures firsthand that are the interface between our water resources and the landscape and the built landscape as well. Erica, I told that you were in quite a few pictures. This is one of my favorite here from Raccoon Mountain. So seeing these landscapes and seeing these spaces expanded the students' understanding as part of our research approach in studio. Supplementing that research approach with more traditional research using GIS and mapping and other types of research gives them the confidence in the information that they need to stand up in front of these communities and provide what I find to be incredibly relevant and well-informed ideas for their futures. A little bit out of order here. So the scope and the scale of these studios have looked at a number of different things, ranging from the scale of the site all the way to the scale of a 41,000 square mile watershed. The first projects here demonstrate this idea of the landscape as infrastructure at the scale of the site, thinking about the opportunities for public parks to be designed in a way that they operate and mitigate flood potential, that they actually cleanse and treat stormwater in a very, perhaps in a very traditional way. Other projects in that same studio took on this question of water resource stewardship at the scale of a site in a much more projective and speculative way, thinking about the harvesting potential and the productive potential of what Market Square here in Knoxville might be. We did a project with the city of Oak Ridge, thinking about ultimately what they came to us interested in was placemaking and form-based codes, which obviously is an important kind of rudiment of practice to talk about, but expanding that and again challenging the assumptions of this project and thinking about also challenging the students to develop their ideas in a way that engages the landscape as a productive infrastructure, not just as an accessory to the urbanism itself. So it is through this project here in Oak Ridge, a project and slide that I show in many presentations that I feel truly begins to capture this idea of the performative capacity of landscape. A landscape that not only serves as a functioning social and an aesthetics public space, but also that operates as part of the stormwater management infrastructure for the community, thereby enabling a denser form of urbanism, a more walkable form of urbanism that has benefits that cascade from that point. Thinking about the landscape as a catalyst for reinvestment, as a catalyst for change, thinking about an urban stream in Cleveland, Tennessee that was buried under buildings, buried under roadways. How can that, the reactivation of the dynamics of this system, not only mitigate flooding, but also become a new catalyst for economic investment in that community? We also, as I mentioned, worked on a project with the Southeast Tennessee Development District, thinking about, again, water quality at the scale of a 13-county region, challenging the students to think not necessarily about the implementation of a project at the scale of a site, but rather a strategy that could be transformed and adjusted to a range of contexts around the region. One of the ideas that came out of this studio was a novel planning idea for complete creeks, which takes the idea of a complete street and makes it as a planning construct for the recapturing of impacted streams, but also as a planning tool for the protection of future streams that happen to be in the path of growth. Also creative opportunities for thinking about managing livestock on the site. And it wasn't necessarily through reading a book that a student came across this idea, but it was through the active process of engagement and visiting a 300-acre cow-calf operation and talking with that individual over time that this idea became possible. So the value of engagement became readily visible here. The same idea of performance is something that I bring to the thesis projects that I've worked on, including those here in the School of Landscape Architecture, a student looking at reorganizing the landscape underneath the I-40 and 275 interchange. What could that potentially become as a catalytic landscape, as a landscape for public health? But also working with students in the School of Architecture and expanding their ideas and thinking about the temporal quality of a landscape, as Whitney Manahan was thinking about in her project, the Forgotten Infrastructure, about how the timeline of redeveloping a brownfield site could be truncated through proactive landscape interventions, thereby unlocking the potential of that site's future much more quickly than otherwise might be available. It was through the kind of pause, if you will, of my Fulbright experience in Slovenia that I had the opportunity to begin this reflection and to think about what I had been teaching in perhaps fragmented ways. How could that become aggregated and coalesced into a single course that would also become a part of our curriculum here in the School of Landscape Architecture. So thinking about these ideas of the history and theory of landscape performance, how it implicates professional practice, in understanding the contemporary precedents of the profession and the fundamental science that drive it was core to my Fulbright experience in building the class while I was there. I was joined by my queen and my squires that you see here in this image on this 5-month-long life-changing experience, certainly for me and certainly for them as well. My attraction to this place, as I mentioned, is rooted in my previous experience there, but also my understanding of the importance of water resources to this country. In very similar ways to that, water resources are very evident and iconic to the landscape here in East Tennessee. These landscapes, these water resources face equal pressures, though we often think about European cities in a very kind of romantic and compact way. The reality is that as you get out to the edges of them, they look quite similar to the landscapes that are here. In fact, I may suggest that if this McDonald's advertisement was not in Slovene, that I could convince somebody that was in outside of Knoxville. So the motorization of the society, the rapid expansion of the footprint of their community created an opportunity for landscape architects to intervene and to become a part of mitigating these challenges through their practice. So it was through the development of this seminar course and through the research that we began to do that these students who shared with me that they had never thought about landscape in this particular way, through which their eyes were open to the performative potential of landscapes and of landscape architects. This same class has now been brought back to the University of Tennessee, and researching and understanding the performative stories of our own landscapes in our own communities, visualizing them and communicating them in compelling ways is a fundamental part of this course. The same idea of landscape performance and engagement has also been exercised in the creative activity that has been stimulated by this teaching, but also has been informed by the teaching as well. Through my creative activity, I've worked on a number of different initiatives, written 2 outreach publications as well, one of which was through the Smart Communities Initiative, something that I participated in not only as a teaching faculty member, but as a member of the planning committee that helped put together this program that is now operating in its 3rd year. The project that I'm speaking of in terms of outreach actually came from that water quality studio. I received a note from my graduate research assistants here this morning excitedly proclaiming that the book is done and is ready for print. So we're happy that HydroLit, the water quality playbook for Southeast Tennessee, will be released here in the very near future. It's up to me to say when it's done, though. This publication, when we were working with the district, their scope of work initially was asking for rain garden designs and constructed wetlands. I think things that are very predictable solutions to water quality challenges. What this publication seeks to do is to expand their understanding of what impacts water quality, things like development patterns, transportation infrastructures, waste management practices, and educational practices as well. Thinking about building the story for what the hydrologic behavior of the region actually is, how human development impacts the system, what the water quality picture looks like for the region, and then calling the region to action through the recalibrated proposals that the students developed in the studio, again, across these different, what we refer to as water quality elements. We use a graphic approach in the publication to make our suggestions for water quality improvement strategies clear. Things like the Creek Squad, which would be an on-demand technical resource available for those who are impacting or developing real estate that may otherwise not have the financial means to secure that level of consultation. Another project that I've had the opportunity to collaborate with Catherine Ambrosiak, a faculty member in the School of Architecture, on these many years has been the Oddfellows Cemetery, a forgotten landscape in East Knoxville with a tremendous story to tell, not only from a social and cultural standpoint, but from the standpoint of its performative potential as well. Thinking about things like how it can be strategically thought of as a water management infrastructure, as a habitat, as a social gathering place, and as a catalyst for the community in which it is located. Together with Catherine, we've mobilized nearly 1,000 students since this project has come to be, building pathways, rendering the site accessible in ways that it had previously not been, all the time taking careful attention to detail and to the sensitivity of the place that only Catherine Ambrosiak could deliver to the project. And inviting the community to participate in the process and to celebrate in its reactivation and reaccessibility as a resource in the community. Through the undergraduate program, I've also worked on a number of rain garden projects on our campus, projects that are close to the Biosystems Engineering Building and also to the Claxton Education Building as well. This idea of service learning and thinking about, again, the performative potential of landscape was something that many of these students had not previously been exposed to, and gave them the opportunity to not only design but also to implement, manage, and monitor the work as well. These projects, though perhaps though they have been very productive, in my mind have been strategically deployed as a way of building a conversation on our campus about what our campus landscape can be. Not to say that every part of our campus landscape needs to look like this or should look like this, but rather thinking about the performative potential of what it can actually do. So that has been kind of a tactical project in the way that it has opened up the opportunity for a conversation about innovative stormwater management practices across our campus, and thinking about actually stormwater management as a way of transforming the aesthetic of our campus in the way that that landscape is activated. So it was through the EPA Rainworks challenge last semester that 2 students and I looked at the renovation of parking lot 66 on the agriculture campus as an opportunity to deploy a district stormwater management approach on our campus, and thinking about the ways that through surplus planning, these landscapes could actually begin to pay for themselves in the way that they provide offsetting stormwater mitigation credit for the other projects that are happening around our campus and that might not have the physical space to actually accommodate the stormwater management requirements on their site. So a lot of information happening here on these slides, but again, thinking about the landscape in a different and in a very productive and critical way. I've worked on a number of projects with colleagues here in the School of Architecture through Plan East Tennessee. Too many projects on this diagram here to count, but showing the reach of this 5-county initiative and the reach of the ideas that our students were able to share and to generate as a result. Coming from this initiative was also the first publication that I worked on with my students, Low Impact Development Opportunities for the Plan ET Region, which was again meant to be a primer for forthcoming stormwater management regulations that in our current political climate may not become regulations after all, but still interesting ways to think about the value and the potential of landscape, and thinking about the way that we visualize and that we communicate these ideas in compelling ways that resonate and that are legible to the multiple audiences for which they're intended. I also had the opportunity to work with the Landscape Performance Series, the Landscape Architecture Foundation, on building their Landscape Performance Series case study library, adding to that library including a project, Chattanooga's Renaissance Park, which has a very compelling and interesting performance story to tell, again, giving students the opportunity to work in these landscapes and to investigate them firsthand, Here we see Luis Venegas, who graduated last year, who's interviewing users at the Atlanta Beltline, which has been an incredibly catalytic landscape intervention outside of or around Atlanta, Georgia, that has to date stimulated over $2 billion in private real estate investment around this pedestrian and future transit corridor. So as I think about the path ahead and the place that these projects and the teaching has gotten me, I still see the same opportunity that attracted me to come here to the University of Tennessee in the first place. As Gail mentioned, our program is an intercollegiate partnership between the College of Architecture and Design and the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources. Now, this partnership is not without its challenges, but also has tremendous benefits that we're in the process of truly understanding how we can leverage that idea of understanding the art and the science of landscape, which I argue is fundamental to the way we think about the landscape in its performance potential. Through this kind of critical reflection and critical understanding, I appreciate the attitude that the program has taken towards a continuous model of improving its curriculum and thinking about ways that it can be improved to address these challenges and to be a diverse educational experience for our students. I look forward to, in the process of doing the same kind of critical look at our undergraduate curriculum and finding ways that the plant sciences and landscape architecture could complement each other more explicitly. As I mentioned, the course that I developed as a Fulbright scholar in Slovenia, Operative Landscapes, is becoming a required part of our curriculum. It's a new course in our living systems sequence, surveying these ideas of performance. A new class that I will be working on and deploying in the spring of next year is the next step in that, and actually deploying these and thinking about at the scale of a site and at the scale most explicitly of applied living materials or plants, how we as designers can activate that potential. The potential that we see in drawings here such as this, and understanding not only anecdotally that a rain garden is capable of treating stormwater or that phytoremediation is possible, but understanding the fundamental biology that's happening in the soil microbiology that actually makes that possible, I think will make for much more powerful designers of the future. My focus will remain on engagement in water resources. I think that these have been productive areas for me in the past and have provided an opportunity to kind of bring those ideas around the newly launched river project, a river studio that was launched in the fall through a partnership with our own governor's chair for energy and urbanism. It was interesting. I was having a conversation with somebody. It may actually have been Gail who warned me. He said, this could take control of your career. And to which I responded that, well, it's there for the taking, but also I would suggest that the work that I have already done, I would argue, could easily fit within the prerogative of this particular type of project, this broad river studio initiative, that at its highest level, I see as being tasked with curating a vision for a landscape that is known for its legacy of multifunctionalism in performance and infrastructure. How do we carry that legacy into the future in the face of prevailing 21st century challenges? The River Project, I see, could catalyze dialogue, facilitate collaboration across disciplines, and in the process generate innovative ideas in promoting change in the communities within that landscape. And the instruments through which that could be done could be any number of different things that I've included here on this list. And things that I see the River Studio or the River Project facilitating into the future. The first step in launching that was the River Studio, which was offered in the fall of 2016, where I had the privilege of working with these 12 motivated students, 6 architects and 6 landscape architects, on our quest to understand the Tennessee River and to understand the Tennessee River watershed. The research for this studio included the Tennessee River tour, which took us on a trip of 5 days over which we covered 1,100 miles, saw all 9 main stem dams, engaged with 18 different stakeholders or voices along the river, and began to see the river system and the landscape as it changed from east to west in new and unexpected ways. Seeing the scale and the operation of the infrastructure that has been imposed on the river system, understanding the ways that it is fundamental to energy systems in the state, understanding the infrastructures and the communities that have come to rely on the river as part of these management processes, understanding, of course, the scale of these infrastructures as well in the way that they create new and novel opportunities in economies as well, thinking about engaging with the voices along the river. Farmer Ron, as we affectionately have come to call him, who operated 3,000 acres of river bottom in southeast or southwest Tennessee around Savannah, was probably one of the more formative engagements, not only of this trip, but also of the history of engagements that I've had over these last 6 years. So this trip was informed by additional modes of research and understanding, building what we call the Tennessee River Atlas, thinking about, again, not just the river as an object or as something that exists between two lines, but rather the river as a watershed, as a landscape that contributes and drains to this place. Thinking about things like climate, thinking about things like the built environment and how it relates or perhaps does not relate to the river as an address. All the while trying to identify and think about what are the 21st century challenges for this landscape, for this system. Things like climate change that we had very close encounters with here regionally in the last 3 or 4 months. Thinking about projected population growth. Thinking about drone use policy as well. And each of these having tremendous cascades of impacts. Perhaps the greatest impact of climate change in our region will not be temperature or ecosystem loss through that temperature precipitation change, but rather it might be the implications of hundreds of thousands of people moving to East Tennessee, or agricultural economy moving to East Tennessee because of abundant water resources, low costs of living, inexpensive energy, and all the things that have perhaps even attracted us to come here as well. So in the context of those identified challenges, students then speculated about the future visions of what the river system and what the river landscape might be. Thinking about the benefits of interconnected transportation systems as a way of experiencing, but also as a way of stewarding the river. Thinking about, again, co-opting industrial landscapes before they become an environmental liability for our future. And thinking about ways that we can be acting proactively today to reduce those challenges and also to co-opt and share that space. Thinking about new and productive economies in the way that this student was projecting a water quality co-opt of an abandoned paper mill outside of Decatur, Alabama, thinking about these mobile water quality tools that could be deployed throughout the watershed while also creating and preserving the robust biodiversity that exists within our river system. Thinking and expanding again upon this idea of complete creeks as a way of planning for the future of stream and river corridors. What are the strategies and toolkits that we might use to enhance our urban relationship to rivers as well? Thinking about dramatic changes of the way that we think about agriculture and that we think about landforming in places where flooding is often a challenge to the agricultural commodity. How can we think about that product and how can we think about that landscape in a way that actually welcomes that dynamic, not that works actively to refuse it? Thinking about the future of agriculture in the region and how it is not a competition between industrial and urban or the mass-produced GMO or the locally produced organic, but how can these systems work together to create a robust ecosystem of agriculture that complements itself and the waste from one become the inputs to the other? How can we challenge the TVA to become, to rethink its model, to rethink its role as a steward of the river system, and as a way of, in the way that they calculate and balance the multiple demands and operational needs that are placed on the river as well. This project has already garnered significant attention. We had one of our first activities outside of the studio was hosted on January the 9th. Was a workshop that attracted more than close to 25 individuals representing a number of different agencies from around the state, many of whom had participated in our fall review and who were very encouraged and optimistic about the potential not only of the student work but also of the ongoing effort that the river project may ultimately become. And so we begin asking questions like what if, and thinking about that previous list of things like competitions and conferences and journals. Well, how can that be accommodated? What's the manifestation of the River Studio outside of the classroom? What if there was actually a Tennessee River Center that may operate at the scale of the watershed in the same way or in the same capacity in terms of stimulating dialogue and proposing new and interesting ideas for physical planning and design across the entire watershed in the same way that the Nashville Civic Design Center operates for the city of Nashville as well. So perhaps the path ahead is not quite as shrouded in mystery as it may have initially seemed. I think that there's a lot of potential and energy behind these projects and the opportunity to continue to explore the performative potential of landscape through the Tennessee River Project, which I would have the opportunity and privilege of stewarding into the future. So I think with that, I'm going to end my talk and to again offer a sincere thank you to those who have been on this journey with me and who have made a lot of the work that you have seen here on the walls possible. And I guess we'll have some time if there are questions from the audience that we can entertain those as well. So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. That was really good survey of the overall arc of your work and project. That was really cool. I get kind of jealous sometimes when I sit on landscape reviews because you guys get to think about like really interesting problems and systems and ecologies and metabolisms and things like that, and they don't have to resolve into a building, which I get kind of jealous about. And so I wonder, while you were talking, I wondered about like the current agency of landscape architects in larger discussions, let's say like public discussions about the really dense, complicated problems of the 21st century. Like do you find, like what would you say is your assessment, like the current status of landscape architects in a kind of world of problematics?
Sure. Well, I would say that I think that that's a really great observation and a great question, that if you think about the taxonomy of practice, if you think about the different kind of hierarchies and types of professionals that are out there, I would suggest that I think that there are some that are actually engaging that in very successful terms. I think that those offices, there are more and more of them all the time, but that's definitely a minority. That many of the practices of landscape architecture are still kind of in kind of the mode of engaging the landscape at the scale of the development or at the scale of the site, and not necessarily connecting to the broader issues in a way that is possible. But I think that one of the things that I've come to appreciate about just the way that a landscape architect or those who are in kind of that mode think is that there is always this kind of scalar relationship that's being questioned and that's being studied. Regardless of what scale you're operating at, I think that inherently it would seem as though there's something kind of in the DNA that mandates that, or that activates that interest in thinking about the broader influence of the context and down all the way to the micro detail as well. So I think that it is through that kind of holistic way of thinking that many of those offices are having the opportunity to experience and perform as leaders on these kind of larger kind of urban or regional ways of thinking about questions and problems. But it's certainly not without the necessary or absolutely necessary support from the allied professions that's even possible, right? So engineers, architects, et cetera, all kind of thinking about those different opportunities and what they might be.
One of the sort of phrases that comes up again, that came up at several points in your presentation, was the idea of grand challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look forward and you look beyond the scope simply of East Tennessee and the Tennessee River, what are the grand challenges?
What are the grand challenges? Well, I mean,
It's a big question.
that is a big question, right? Gosh, I think that we've encountered a significant grand challenge in the last 4 weeks, right? I mean, I think that political partisanship aside, I think that there is an increasingly high level of reticence of trust and expertise, so that whether or not, we could talk about grand challenges in the sense of kind of, public health and water resources and population shifts and flooding in the coast and climate change. But I think that perhaps the grander challenge that we all have to be thinking about as designers is how do we operate and how do we advocate in this environment where to certain communities and to certain parts of our constituencies, our very expertise and the validity of our consultation is questioned, right? It's becoming an increasingly difficult proposition when the kind of fallback of, well, the law requires us to do this. If we think specifically about water resource stewardship in the last whatever, I mean, that's something that, I think many communities have used as their battle cry when they go to developers to advocate for practices that I would like to think they understand to be just what needs to be done. But when that regulatory impetus falls away, then the responsibility of the designer, of the advocate, becomes much more difficult, but also much more important.
As an extension of your answer to her question,
Yes.
I'm curious about the political economy of performance and performative landscapes. And I just wonder about, there are two scales of that I see in what you're talking about. One was kind of foregrounded by Gail when he pitched you, and then you corroborated this as critical to the discipline, or critical of the profession, rather. Not of discipline, but critical of the profession,
Mm-hmm.
which suggests that this research and teaching has the ability or there's a desire embedded in it to impact the kind of political condition of the very profession. Then there's another scale of political economy that I see in the work you're doing is particular, I think, to the Tennessee River Studio, which is how will these constituents actually be able to anticipate the change that's required based on the research when they themselves might not actually believe that things need to change.
Sure.
And that's heightened, I think, since recently anyway.
Right.
Right. So the political economy of performance.
Yeah, so that question reminds me of a conversation that we had at the River Studio workshop where we were going around the room, and there was folks there from the state parks, there was folks there from kind of local agencies, and there also a real estate developer who was kind of working at kind of the scale of path of growth, land brokerage, and a real estate attorney who was there and kind of bringing everybody back down to reality in the sense that, it doesn't, necessarily matter what the ecological or even the social benefits of a particular strategy may be. At the end of the day, it has to translate into dollars and cents. And his kind of reticence was that, in the case of the river, was how do we advocate for a resource that is incredibly abundant, and that is, in the case of water quality, moving at a volume and at a rate that really kind of mitigates and dilutes a lot of the challenges that other communities would face in different ways. So, he was thinking about how do we communicate that scarcity, and how do we communicate any particular argument for a project in a currency that someone who has the ability to make those choices will understand. I don't know that I necessarily have the right answer for that, but I think that I'll say this, and then I will immediately contradict myself based on what I just told Tracy, in the sense that, through the governor's chair and through a relationship with ORNL, I think that we have some of the tools at our disposal to begin to speculate the scarcity of the future of a resource, whether it's water or whether it's real estate or whether it's agricultural property, in the way that urbanization and population growth models can begin to speculate what that might be, right? But then you're still faced with that same problem of convincing the politician or convincing that somebody else that model is actually trustworthy or is worth something that we should be looking at because of the uncertainty of the future. So I don't have the answer to that. I think that that's a great question that we'll need to be looking at continuously through this work, and certainly something that will be a great challenge in the future. Paul?
As someone who's had a rich variety of design experiences from academia to the professional world, how would you advise a young professional in determining which opportunities they should chase and which ones they should probably pass on? Because I know that you probably had a lot of those opportunities.
Sure. We'll talk about that in pro practice on Thursday, right? No, it's a great question. It's again one that I think that it has to be taken in a particular context and able to answer it. If I really even should answer that, as I was preparing the lecture, I was thinking about the what ifs. Like what if I had done something different, or what if I had been at Ohio State 3 years later when Jane Amidon and Jane Wolfe and Laurel McSherry were there. It was a very different program, right? And so my professional trajectory, my launch point would have been significantly different. What if I had been in an office that I had an equal amount of respect for and kind of the critical nature of their work as I already do have a respect for kind of the leadership and the camaraderie and the interpersonal culture of that office? What my career look like now. But I think that, my answer to all those questions is I wouldn't change anything, because what I've done has brought me to this particular moment, and I don't know that I would trade that for anything. I think that at any particular decision point in one's career, I think that it's important to look at it very objectively, and not to either positively or negatively, if that's even possible, romanticize what the opportunity is. But if I'm a very pragmatic person, so if you look at something in that light, that there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but just your answer and the level of rigor that you bring to making that choice, I think will take you on a path that will be successful. So, that's something that we talk about in pro practice every time we talk to somebody outside of the classroom, is that I could never have charted this out. I could have never predicted that I'd be standing behind this podium here tonight. But you'll find that these moments in your career that right now will seem very distant and perhaps very intimidating. When you're in that moment, I think they'll become very clear in what the right choice may be. All right? Great. Thank you all very much.